Notre-Dame de Paris by Victor Hugo. Book 1. The Great Hall. 348 years, 6 months, and 19 days ago today, the people of Paris awoke to hear all the church bells in the triple enclosure of the city, the university, and the town in full voice. Not that 6 January 1482 is a day of which history has kept any record. There was nothing noteworthy about the event that set the burgesses and belles of Paris in motion from early morning. It was not an assault by Picards or Burgundians. It was not a reliquary being carried in procession. It was not a student revolt in the vineyard of Las. It was not an entry by our most redoubtable Lord Monsieur the King. It was not even a fine hanging of male and female thieves on the gallows of Paris. Nor was it the arrival, so frequent in the 15th century, of an embassy in all its plums and finery. It was barely 2 days since the last cavalcade of this kind, that of the Flemish ambassadors charged with concluding the marriages between the Dauphin and Marguerite of Flanders, had made its entry into Paris, much to the annoyance of Monseigneur the Cardinal of Bourbon, who, to please the king, had had to put on a smile for this uncouth mob of Flemish burgomasters, and entertain them in his Hôtel de Bourbon with a very fine morality, satire, and farce. As driving rain drenched the magnificent tapestries in his doorway, what had excited all of the commonalty of Paris, as Jean de Troyes puts it, on this January the 6th, was the twin ceremony of Twelfth Night and the Feast of Fools, which had fallen on the same day since time immemorial. Today there was to be a bonfire, on the grave a maypole, a barrack's chapel, and a mystery play at the Palais de Justice. These had been trumpeted at the crossroads the previous evening by the provost's men in their handsome actions of mauve camlet, with large white crosses on the breast. And so, first thing, the crowd of townsmen and women had shut up their shops and houses and made their way from every side toward one of the 3 appointed sites. Everyone had made his choice, some for the bonfire, others for the maypole, others for the mystery. We must pay tribute to the ancient good sense of the sightseers of Paris and tell you that the greater part of this crowd was either making for the bonfire, which was highly seasonable, or for the mystery, which was to be given in comfort and under cover in the great hall of the palace, and that by common consent they left the poorly arrayed maypole to shiver all alone under the January sky in the graveyard of Barrack's Chapel. The people were mostly flocking the approaches to the Palais de Justice, for it was known that the Flemish ambassadors who had arrived 2 days before were intending to be present at the performance of the mystery, as well as the election of the Fool's Pope, likewise due to take place in the Great Hall. It was no easy matter to get inside the Great Hall that day, although it had the reputation at the time of being the largest covered enclosure in the world. True, Sauvel had yet to measure the Great Hall of the Chateau de Montargis. To the onlookers at their windows, the palace square, which was packed with people, resembled a sea into which, like so many river mouths, 5 or 6 streets were constantly disgorging fresh torrents of heads. As they continued to swell, the waves of people collided with the corners of the houses, which here and there jutted out into the irregular basin of the square, like so many promontories. In the center of the palace's tall Gothic facade, twin streams flowed up and down the great staircase without interruption, and then, after breaking halfway below the entrance steps, spread down the 2 ramps at the sides in broad waves, so that the great staircase emptied ceaselessly into the square like a waterfall into a lake. The shouting and the laughter and the tramp of thousands of feet made a great noise and clamor. At times, this noise and clamor were intensified, and the current that was sweeping all these people toward the great staircase faltered and turned back on itself, forming eddies. An archer had just lashed out, or a provost sergeant horse reared up to restore order, an admirable tradition which the provost bequeathed to the constables to the marshals, and the marshals to our own Paris Gendarmerie. Doorways, windows, dormers, and roofs were alive with the calm, law-abiding faces of thousands of good burgesses, who asked for nothing better than to stare at the palace and the mob, for many people in Paris are content merely to gaze at the gazers, and for us a high wall behind which something is going on is in itself an object of keen curiosity. Were we, men of 1830, to be granted the power of mingling in spirit with these Parisians of the 15th century, and accompanying them as they shoved, elbowed, and stumbled their way into the vast hall of the palace, so constricted on that 6th January of 1482, the spectacle would lack neither interest nor charm, and everything around us would be so old as to seem to us quite new. If the reader agrees, we shall try to recapture in the mind's eye the impression he, like us, would have got as he crossed the threshold of the great hall, in the midst of this throng of surcoats, actions, and coat-hardies. And right away our ears are dinned and our eyes dazzled. Above our heads a double Gothic vault, with carved wood paneling, painted sky blue, with gold fleur-de-lis. Beneath our feet a pavement of alternate black and white marble. A few yards away an enormous pillar, then another and another. In all 7 pillars, along the length of the hall, supporting the springings of the double vault at its midpoint. Around the first 4 pillars, the stalls of tradesmen, sparkling with glass and tinsel. Around the last 3 oak branches, worn away and polished by the hose of litigants and the robes of attorneys. All round the hall, along the high wall, between doors, casements, and pillars, the endless row of statues of all the kings of France. Since Pharamond, the indolent kings, their arms dangling and their eyes lowered, and the valiant warrior kings, with head and hands raised boldly to heaven. Then, in the tall pointed windows, stained glass of every color, at the wide exits from the hall, rich, delicately carved doorways, and the whole thing, vaulting pillars, walls, door frames, paneling, doors, and statues, splendidly illuminated from top to bottom in blue and gold. This illumination was already somewhat tarnished by this time, and had almost completely vanished beneath the dust and spiders' webs by the year of grace 1549, when de Breuil could still admire it out of tradition. If you now picture this vast rectangular hall by yourselves, lit by the pallid January daylight and invaded by a noisy motley crew drifting along the walls and swirling round the 7 pillars, then you will already have a confused idea of the general picture, of which we shall now try to fill in some curious details. Certain it is that Ravaillac had not assassinated Henry IV. The documents for Ravaillac's trial would not have been deposited in the record office of the Palais de Justice. There would have been no accomplices to profit from the disappearance of the aforesaid documents, hence no incendiaries obliged, for want of a better method, to burn down the record office in order to burn the documents, and to burn down the Palais de Justice in order to burn down the record office. And so finally, no fire of 1618, the old palace would still be standing together with its great hall, and I could say to the reader, go and see it, and so we would both be spared, I from writing, and he from reading a makeshift description of it, which goes to prove this brand new truth. The great events have incalculable consequences. True, it is very possible, in the first place, that Ravaillac had no accomplices, and then, if by any chance he did have some, that they had no hand in the fire of 1618. There exists two other highly plausible explanations for this. First, the great flaming star, a foot across and a cubit high, which everyone knows fell from the sky on that palace after midnight on March the 7th. Secondly, Theophile's quatrain. A sad sport indeed it was, when in Paris Dame Justice ate too many sweeteners, and caused a palais teal fire. And then there's a footnote saying this joke works better in French, where the slang word for bribe is épice, or literally spice, thus justifying the palatial fire. Whatever your views on this threefold explanation, political, physical, or poetical, of the burning down of the Palais de Justice in 1618, the unfortunately certain fact is the fire. Thanks to the catastrophe, and thanks above all to the various restorations which successfully finished off what it had spared, very little remains today of this first residence of the kings of France. A palace senior to the Louvre, and already so old in the days of Philip the Fair that they searched for traces there of the magnificent buildings put up by King Robert and described by Helgaldus. Almost everything has gone. What has become of the chamber of the Chancellery, where St. Louis consummated his marriage, or the garden where he meted out justice, dressed in a camlet tunic, a surcoat of wincery without sleeves, and a cloak over all of black, sendal lying on rugs together with Joinville? Where is the Emperor Sigismund's chamber, or Charles IV's, or John Lackland's? Where the staircase from which Charles VI issued his Edict of Grace? The flagstone where, in the presence of the Dauphin, Marcel cut the throats of Robert de Clermont and the Marshal of Champagne? The wicket gate where the bulls of the anti-pope Benedict were defaced, or whence those who had brought them departed again, mockingly clad in copes and mitres, to make honourable amends all over Paris? And the great hall, with its gildings, its sky blue, its pointed arches, its statues, its pillars, its huge vault all jagged with carvings, and the gilded chamber, and the stone lion that stood at the door, head down and tail between its legs, like the lions of Solomon's throne, in the attitude of humiliation proper to might before justice, and the beautiful doors, and the beautiful stained glass, and the carved ironwork which so disheartened Biscornet, and the delicate joinery of Duhancy. When has time done? What have men done to these wonders? And what have we been given instead of all that Gaelic history and all that Gothic art? For art, the heavy depressed arches of M. de Brosse, the clumsy architect of the St. Gervais period, of the St. Gervais portal. Well, for history, we have the garrulous memoirs of the big pillar still echoing to the backbiting of our Patras, which is not much, but we must return to the real great hall of the real old palace, and we will pause there.